nourished, healed, protected, and embrace the Kumeyaay people to the present day. It is part of a worldview founded in the harmony of the cycles of the sky and balance in the forces of life. It is important for us to pay our respects for the past, present, and future generations of Kumeyaay people. And we are here with San Diego 350, so I'm happy to share our mission right now. San Diego 350 is an inclusive volunteer organization building a movement to prevent the worst impacts of climate change and climate injustice. We strive to create a future that supports a livable planet and just society through education and outreach, public policy advocacy, and mobilizing people to take action. Now, pivoting just a bit, we're going to talk briefly about our community norms. So there are quite a few on the slide that you'll see coming up. But the three that we want to highlight specifically are norms 1, 2, and 8. So for norm number 1, I will treat everyone with respect and work together toward our common goals. Norm number 2, I will be an active listener and learner. And norm number 8, I will create a safe space in our meetings and in our work. SD 350 does not tolerate any forms of oppressive behavior, in particular, any sexism, racism, anti-Blackness, classism, homophobia, transphobia, or ableism. So please just keep these 3 and all of our community norms in mind when participating in this space tonight. Now, without further ado, I'm so excited to pass the mic to Kim.
Hi, Nicole. Thank you. Hi, everyone. And thanks, Max, as well, for setting this up. My name is Kimberly Keyshawn, and I'm the president of the board of directors with San Diego 350. And first off, I just want to thank you all for joining us tonight for this important and timely topic. Many of you are likely joining us because you're wondering how you can help, what you can do to prevent hate crimes by fighting the bystander effect. So we're glad that you're with us. And we're hopeful that we can stand for justice together by brushing up on some history and practicing some allyship skills. And tonight we hope to equip you with some information that will help you become a stronger observer so that you will notice when something concerning is happening and step up to do or say something that improves community safety. So with that, I think I'll hand it off to Rebecca.
Thanks, Kim. I'm Rebecca. I'm also on the board of San Diego 350. Max, do you mind putting it to slide number 5? Yes. Before we continue with the presentation, we want to share a little bit about why we believe these issues are important for climate activists. Why are we focusing on AAPI issues and racism against that community and Jewish communities? First, we all want to live in a world where everyone is safe and treated with dignity. To that end, we must make hate unacceptable in our society by taking action against hate speech and hateful actions. Caring about racism is also important to achieving our goal of social justice and recognizing the interconnected issue of climate change and racism. Standing up for others and showing solidarity also builds resilience in our communities. And we don't want racism, sexism, homophobism, or any otherism to be a tool of division for the powers that be, and to keep us from fighting together for an equitable and just world. So standing up for each other, building an anti-racist and inclusive movement, from our point of view, will lead to a more powerful climate movement. Kim, it's you again, I believe.
Yep, thanks, Rebecca. So we do have some local examples that we want to share with you. But before we do, we want to give you fair warning that the next slide describes 2 hate-driven incidents that resulted in deaths, one of which was local. And we know this is traumatic for many of us. In fact, most of us. So if you prefer not to be exposed to this any more than you already are in your daily life, you can excuse yourself for the next few minutes. Otherwise, we do think it's really important to take a look at local examples to see what's actually happening here in San Diego.
Next slide, please. Can I get someone who's willing to volunteer to read the little clip on the left? You can, I don't know if I can see you raise your hand. Carly, I did see you raise your hand.
Okay, March 4th, 2021. The 42 San Diego County incidents reported to stop AAPI Hate mirror a national trend towards more hate crimes and racist incidents against Asian Americans. The group's records show 2,808 firsthand accounts of anti-Asian hate from 47 states and the District of Columbia between the middle of March 2020, when the pandemic set in, and the end of December. He said attacks seem to only be escalating, where they actually push and shove the elderly and actually kill them, he said. It's scary for me to see how hateful America has become, or maybe has always been. KPBS, Claire Tregesser.
Sorry, I was on mute. Can I get another volunteer to read the little snippet on the right? I can't see if you're raising your hand maybe, but if you want to stick a...
I think Trung is volunteering.
Oh, Trung, yes, please, go for it.
Hi. On April 27th, 2019, the last day of Passover, a gunman opened fire inside a synagogue in Poway, California, killing one person and wounding 3 others. Authorities said a man was taken into custody in connection with the shooting. The gunman, whom officials identified as John Ernest, a 19-year-old resident of San Diego, screamed that Jews were ruining the world as he stormed the synagogue.
Thank you so much, Carly and Trung, for reading that. Next, I'm going to pass it off to Rachel.
Thank you, Rebecca. Hello, everyone. My name is Rachel. I'm the Justice and Equity intern here at San Diego 350. So I think it's really important when we talk about anti-Asian sentiment, any sentiments against Jewish Americans. We really have to think about language and how important language plays a part in the violence that happens to these communities, because language is so powerful because it shapes our thoughts and cultural attitudes. So seemingly harmless jokes and blanket statements about groups of people that are based on race or any other markers of identity can always end up snowballing and form thoughts and attitudes for an entire group of people that becomes othering and therefore less human. So dismissive, derogatory, or quote unquote joking language contributes to the dehumanization of entire groups of people, and if left unchecked, can stoke prejudice in many forms, just from an example of like passing someone over for a promotion, all the way to the acts of violence that we've been seeing today. So when we think of subtle forms of racism, we see that in these communities, not in these communities, but towards these communities, subtle forms of racism like jokes and language largely go unchecked, which ends up perpetuating and normalizing this harmful attitude and behavior. And this is why it's important to think critically about inclusive language and language that's not harmful. So when we think of inclusive language, we can think of some examples like folks or everyone, guys, and well, rather than guys, say like these 2 phrases, when we're thinking in these spaces of just being equitable in general, using people's preferred pronouns, learning how to pronounce people's names properly. And if you don't know, ask them. That's so easy to do, you know, and don't make generalized statements, because we can see these situations where jokes become stereotypes, become othering, become oppression, and then violence. So if we allow words of minoritization, scapegoating, xenophobia, dehumanization, people will experience harassment, assault, hate crimes, and segregation. So I will pass it over to Kim.
Thanks, Rachel. Max, can you advance to the next slide, please? Oh, actually go back one. There we go. Okay, thanks. So there are some specific threats to Jewish Americans, and it's important to highlight that none of this is new. It actually tends to come in waves, and we need to aggressively combat it, just like other forms of racism. Even, for example, even non-religious Jews are scared when these waves come, because historically that hasn't mattered in terms of dehumanization and persecution. And when I say aggressively combat it, there are a few ways I see that happening, but they all require familiarity with the dangers. So in order to be able to pick up on them and dig in accordingly, you have to have some familiarity with what the dangers are and what the risks are, what are the common harmful myths and stereotypes to not support and to call out when you see them, or when you see somebody supporting one of those. And it's also worth noting that some of these are the items at the top there. Those are really relevant currently. So you may hear subtle references to things like this, whether it's in family or broader community groups. And if it just doesn't sound right to you, it helps if you have the background knowing what these three topics are about. So we'll give you a link to this presentation so you could have access to these links and do some further research if you're not familiar with these topics. We're not going to get too far into them today. But just to continue on that topic, it's also worth noting that there's anti-Semitism both on the right and on the left, which is yet another important reminder to see people individually and not as representatives of a whole group. And similar to people who America commonly refers to as Asians, Jews are also not monolithic. We're not a monolithic homogenous group. There are Black Jews, Latinx Jews, liberal and conservative Jews, as well as those who identify as culturally Jewish, but not as religious. So I think I'm passing it on to Rebecca to introduce our guest speaker now.
Yes. Thank you. Hi, everyone. We're really excited to welcome Kent Lee. He is the co-chair of San Diego API Coalition and the executive director of the Pacific Arts Movement. He is also running for city council in 2022 for District 6. So he is going to share a little presentation with us. So please welcome him.
Thanks everyone for having me. If you don't mind, I'm going to load up some slides really quick. And again, as Rebecca shared, and again, appreciate the chance just to chat about all of this with everyone, and appreciate especially the interest in learning. I think what we've discovered is that there is always a lot to learn, and I like to preface this by sharing that I am certainly not a history major myself, and some of the topics that I share in this presentation are items that I also learned along the way, and I think that's sort of an important reflection on the journey we all have. The San Diego Asian Pacific Islander Coalition was something that formed during the pandemic last year, largely to respond to the increases we were seeing in hate and racism directed towards the API community. A lot of our work lately has to do with awareness education, but also thinking about the work that we have in solidarity with other communities as well. And I think as we talk about what's happening today, it's impossible not to reflect on our history, because I think what we find in history is that history has a tendency to repeat itself. And what we're seeing today is not actually unique to this moment or to the pandemic, but actually a reflection perhaps of what we've seen in the past as well. This is not going to be all encompassing, but I do like to share some moments in history that might be reflective. May is Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. It commemorates both the arrival of Japanese immigrants in the 1800s. It's also typically thought of as the time when the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, where a majority of their workers were Chinese immigrants. And when we think back to that time period in the 1800s, we actually realize that restrictive immigration policy, hatred and discrimination were always a common presence for us as a country. In fact, the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 was one of the most first and most significant laws restricting immigration specifically by race. And what it was as a result of the gold rush in the 1800s, there was this fear that the influx of Chinese immigrant laborers was going to take away good paying jobs from Americans. And as a result, they ended up banning immigration from Chinese Americans for about 10 years. And the Chinese Exclusion Act itself wasn't even repealed until I think the 1940s or so. At that same time, a lot of what we hear today about building walls and keeping people out, again, was reflected back in that time in history. Even though Chinese Americans represented such a very small portion of the population, they were often blamed with adding to some sense of impurity within the United States. And how that relates to the pandemic is that when we think about the rhetoric and language that you saw at the beginning of the year last year, in terms of this disease coming from China, must be a result of what they eat or their hygiene practices, that's actually similar to what we saw over 100 years ago. An example that I share is that in 1900, there was an outbreak of bubonic plague in San Francisco. And as a response to that, what they ended up doing was quarantining the entirety of Chinatown in San Francisco as a result, as if that was the cause of it. When we fast forward in history, something to reflect upon is in the 1940s with the World War II, we had the Executive Order 9066, which ended up placing about 120,000 people in incarceration. Many of these were, in fact, American citizens, and they were placed in these internment camps for years. And the impact is significant. As a result of Japanese Americans being in internment camps during that time, many of these families were second, third, even fourth generation families. They lost their homes, their jobs. There are plenty of stories of families who, children who were born or grew up in internment, and that is a pretty significant part of their experience. This is an example of a flyer that was put out in 1942 in San Francisco asking Japanese Americans to report for internment. It's something that applies to us here in San Diego. In fact, there are actually a couple of documentaries that have been done in San Diego talking about stories of Japanese Americans who were actually rounded up here as well. And really the juxtaposition against this is also this image. There were actually not just two, but there were two battalions that are not battalions, regimental combat teams that are often spoken of. A lot of people don't know about this in history, but the full 42nd and the 100th regimental combat teams were two of the most decorated units that served on the European front during World War II. There were also two units that suffered some of the highest casualty rates of any American armed forces, and they were Japanese Americans who believed that perhaps the only way that they could prove their loyalty as American citizens was to actually serve in our armed forces. Going back a little bit, San Diego is also a community with a pretty significant Filipino American presence. And it's important to look back at how, for Filipino Americans, many of them immigrated to the United States as laborers in the early 1900s. And at the time, they actually restricted immigration to allow Filipino men, but oftentimes not Filipino women. And what ended up happening was that a lot of them ended up dating, white women. They worked, in a number of jobs, and again began to cause this feeling that perhaps these foreigners were taking away good-paying American jobs. What ended up happening were Stockton and Watsonville riots. We had hundreds of people, mobs, who ended up pretty much burning down, bombing, killing Filipino Americans. And by 1933, the Supreme Court ended up determining, the California Court of Appeals ended up determining that Filipinos were classified as a type of Asian that were therefore prohibited from marrying anyone who was white. Filipinos ended up becoming a large part of the labor movement. And I think that we talk about this sometimes to show how history is not just about what has taken place, but sometimes it's about what has actually not been spoken about. And when we look at the labor movement for Filipino Americans in particular, the gentleman on the left here, Larry Itliong, was a huge part of the labor movement. And many don't talk about him in the same vein as when they talk about Cesar Chavez, even though Filipino workers actually were the ones who first started the grape strike that Cesar Chavez and Mexican American laborers joined almost 8 weeks later. Larry Itliong and Cesar Chavez both started the United Farm Workers. Larry was actually the vice president of it when it started. And again, you don't see that talked about in history. And I'm still surprised sometimes in these presentations about members who marched and striked in those times who had no idea that Filipino Americans were part of the movement. And then in 1980s, we have the murder of Vincent Chin. And this is pretty much a seminal moment where I think here in the United States, we began to question what constitutes a hate crime. Vincent Chin was 23, I believe, at the time. He was very young. He was Chinese American, actually. But there was a sentiment in Detroit at the time that Japanese American auto workers were taking away good jobs from, again, Americans. And he was murdered by two men who ultimately were charged with manslaughter, pleaded guilty, but released on probation and only charged a $3,000 fine. And finally, when you think back to even post 9/11, you recognize that again, hate comes in many forms. This, for example, was just when you reflect on the experience of South Asians following 9/11, the Sikh community in particular was often targeted as if they were tied into the community, that had caused 9/11. And that kind of stereotyping and profiling in general by religion, by looks, has had a significant impact. Even to this present day, when we look at, the Muslim ban and other restrictive policies that have been considered even in the last couple of years. Lastly, I show this as an example. This is a poster that was actually found on the campus of UC San Diego in 2017. And if you recognize it, it reflects the same kind of image as the one calling for Japanese Americans to report for internment in 1942. And whether it was posted as a act of hate or maybe to stoke some sense of shock, it's a reminder that, again, what we saw 75, 80 years ago might not be that unfamiliar with what we've heard in rhetoric today. For Asian Americans, representation in media is also a significant impact. It, in many ways, determines how people perceive what it means to be Asian American. It is shocking how significant that impact can be. When we look back at history, we often talk these days about whitewashing, and that's a practice that has been in place for many, many years, decades, where Asian American roles would often be played by someone who was not Asian American. We talk about the exoticization and the fetishization of Asian American women. That relates back sometimes to what we see during the Vietnam War. In fact, I've seen conversations that talk about how American imperialism in Asia has in many ways impacted the way that we perceive Asians in general. And then really even just an example like The Simpsons, many of you probably know the character Apu from The Simpsons for over 30 years now. There's actually a documentary from the last couple of years that would be great to watch. It's called The Problem with Apu. And it really takes the South Asian experience reflecting on how Apu defined for decades how Americans would perceive the South Asian community, just from that single caricature. And it's important to note that Apu has been played all of these years by a white male using an imitated accent to represent that voice. These impacts in media aren't just a part of history, they are still reflected in how we see media today, casting, even taking shows that were once done in animation and seeing the difference as they're put into real life. And even with some of the most popular films of the day. It's not just in casting. Sometimes what we see in representation in media is also the way that we perceive other people and what might be foreign. This is an example of a film, and I forget the name of the film, but when you look at it, I believe it was to represent Bangladesh at the time. And what you see is this huge yellow filter that's placed over the image. And the real life image isn't this yellow. But what actually happens often is that in creating films where they're looking to create this perception of dirtiness from typically what they consider to be third world developing countries, you see this yellow filter that's often applied. Even in times, and this is the film Great Wall, where it was not an example of whitewashing, but the constant sort of perception of how white saviors were portrayed in films sort of played into even this co-production that was done with China. And then finally, it brings us to today. I mean, we've had a lot of films that have changed the argument about representation that have maybe moved the needle a little bit with things like Crazy Rich Asians or Searching or Fresh Off the Boat. But even in 2017, I think only 3% of top film roles and film directors were of API descent, despite Asian Americans having been a much larger portion of our community. A lot of people think about Crazy Rich Asians and they think, wow, that's the first time that we've had an all Asian cast since the Joy Luck Club 25 years earlier. And what we realize is that's actually not the case. But what we see is that we've had films over the years that have represented Asian American stories, that have played at major festivals. This is Aquafina and the Farewell just a couple of years ago, that maybe just don't get the same kind of mainstream attention. Until finally, I think last year, a lot of people don't now sort of are just shocked that only a couple of weeks before we closed down for the pandemic was this historic win by Parasite as a foreign language film winning Best Picture at the Oscars. So it brings us to today with the arrival of COVID-19. It's been just over a year now since the pandemic first arrived on our shores. I share this photo of Chinatown, San Francisco, back from last February, because when you look at this, you realize that this is a photo from pre-masks, pre-working from home, pre-stay at home, and already at that time, there was a significant amount of fear about retaliation and the racism that was impacting API communities, for example, in San Francisco. We know a lot of this has to do with rhetoric. I mean, we just talked about how the choice of language has a significant impact on how people perceive things. And it also has an impact on how we treat each other. There's no question that the language from our administration in calling the disease things like the Kung Flu had a significant impact on how not just the virus, that they.
We're losing.
So what sprung up last? Oh, I just was told that my internet connection is unstable. So let me know if I'm back. Okay.
You're back.
So last year, what did form was a database called Stop AAPI Hate. I'm sure many of you have heard about it at this point. The latest data just released over a week ago shows that there have been over 6,600 cases across the country reported since March of last year. Many of these involve the elderly. Young people are not exempt from this. As you saw in Atlanta, Georgia, with the deaths of 6 Asian Americans, women in particular, women are more likely to be attacked by more than 2 times. And in many of these cases, race has often been cited as the primary reason for why people felt like they were being discriminated. This is just a listing of a number of the incidents that we've seen across the country. And I think what's shocking is that even as we saw some of these cases sparked up at the beginning of this year, which mind you is already almost a year since the pandemic started and some of these concerns had first popped up, it wasn't until actors like Daniel Tae Kim or Daniel Wu put out a reward that really began to spark media attention on this. And I think it's important to note that it shouldn't take some kind of bounty by, celebrities in order to call attention to this as an issue. We've seen rallies and outcries across this country asking for people to stop Asian hate. This headline was, especially sad for, I think, a lot of us to see, just the idea that hundreds of volunteers were gathering together just to think about how they protect Asian American seniors, for them to go shopping, to get their COVID vaccination. And this hasn't been unique just outside of San Diego. I think in the report that you shared earlier, there had been 42 cases reported in San Diego through December of 2020. And what I share now is that in the latest update of disaggregated data from Stop AAPI Hate, we now see that there have been over 100 cases reported since last March in San Diego. That's over 240% more since we just reported a couple months earlier this year. Again, many of these are largely women, 8% of them are the elderly, and as has been acknowledged by even our own elected officials, there's a significant amount of underreporting that's suspected. I won't go through all of these slides. I mean, some of these are data points that have been shared by the Stop AAPI Hate campaign, showing that it's impacting every demographic, age group, that many of these cases happen in public areas, from parks to transit to even at our local businesses. And finally, they impact Asian American communities who are not a monolith. And even though Chinese Americans have been disproportionately impacted here, we see that, you know, other demographics within the Asian American community, even folks who identify as being white, have been targets of hate. What we've seen in San Diego is, again, a decline in patronage as early as last January. If you recall, that timeframe is typically the Lunar New Year holiday for a number of API communities, and they were already expressing concerns about events that they were holding. We saw different types of harassment, threats of physical attack, and plenty of times people being asked to go back to China, whether or not they were identifying as being Chinese or from China to begin with. The API coalition formed in response to this. We've been working with the city, the county, and with other organizations across San Diego to try to respond, think about how we present awareness, but also to think about how our elected officials and our government can actually help play a role in responding. A lot of times people ask, what can we do? And I know we're going to talk more about allyship tonight and how people can avoid just being a bystander. And I think what I always start with is the need for people to educate themselves. I think if I've shared something with you tonight that was new to you, that likely means that there are many others who have not heard the history, don't understand the context of AAPI racism. The second piece really is solidarity and allyship. I think it's impossible for us not to emphasize that this is not just about speaking out against hate driven towards the AAPI community. We understand that that's maybe what's taking place right now, and that news cycle at some time will pass. But we know that there is a reality that there is hate impacting many other communities, many marginalized communities, as a part of their entire American history. And it's important that if we're going to speak out, we find ways to speak out against any and all forms of hate. We also suggest supporting local immigrant-owned businesses who in many cases have been doubly impacted, one by profiling and discrimination, and then second by the pandemic itself. These are a couple of resources that I'll put here. I noticed someone put the bystander training below already, which is a tremendous resource. It's a partnership between Hollaback and the Asian Americans Advancing Justice chapter out of Los Angeles. Those bystander intervention trainings tend to fill up weeks in advance. So if you're interested, certainly recommend taking it. And then maybe one last resource to recommend is that KPBS or PBS last year played a sort of a historic series called Asian Americans. It was a 5-part documentary done by some of the most recognized documentary filmmakers within the Asian American community, sharing a lot of the history that I shared earlier tonight, but really over this 5-hour series. So if you get a chance, they have made that free on PBS, and I highly recommend it as a way to learn. And with that, I will pass it back.
You can.
To Rebecca.
And Max, can you put our slides up? I think Rachel is on.
Yes.
Slide 11, please.
Awesome. Cool. Kim, did you want to do this one?
Sorry, first, yeah, I just want to thank Kent for joining us and sharing all of those insights and your perspective with us. There's definitely a lot that I learned. I did not know that Filipinos were involved in the farm worker movement, and I'm really glad to know that, and definitely interested to research more about that now. And we actually have a couple slides that touch on things that you already covered. So I think Rachel's going to go through them pretty quickly now.
Yes. Awesome. All right. We can go to the next slide. So as we continue to talk about how we as individuals can do this work to make sure that we're stopping hate or any actions as we see them, we really have to think about how do you interrupt offensive behavior or harmful behavior. And that's where the phrases calling in and calling out kind of come in. And this idea is a very large idea, so we can't really get to every nitty gritty detail of it, but I think it'll be helpful even if we do a brief overview of the two ideologies. So when we think of calling in and calling out, they are both very useful tools, and it depends on the situation and your own comfortability on how you're going to use which one. So with calling out, your purpose is to quickly stop harm and show solidarity. So that's the instances when we're seeing like violence, we're seeing offensive verbal abuse, just things of that nature, where it needs to be stopped immediately. You need to step in between. And calling out is typically done in a more public setting when the oppressive behavior needs to be stopped right away, and you need to show some support for the impacted person. And I think that second part is the most important. You need to show that support for the person who is being harmed. So that's the idea for calling out. But when we think of calling in, the purpose for that is more for changed behavior. So rather than just trying to stop it immediately, you're thinking about how can we work together to make sure this doesn't happen again in the future. So when you observe someone that you are maybe closer to, you might have more of a relationship, it's easier to call in because you're able to thoughtfully engage them on how their behavior is being harmful in the moment. So this is usually done privately after the incident, or just in a more just separate manner away from the individual who is harmed in the moment. But I think it's important to note that both of these methods are important because even unintentionally harmful statements can create cumulative trauma and a toxic culture. So let's say someone said something that is very hurtful. An example of calling in could be, hey, I wanted to chat with you about something you said earlier. Did you know that that kind of language can lead to violence against the AAPI community? Are you keeping up to news with everything that's going on right now? An example of calling out, let's say in this situation, could be like, I need to push it back against that. That's not respectful or representative of the AAPI community's culture or values. So these are just two ideas and thoughts or examples on how you could do this kind of work. Next slide, please. Awesome. So I know we just talked about the bystander. Also, I'm so sorry. I think someone is drag racing outside of my window. So ignore that if that happens. But they're doing it now. But I think when we talk about the bystander intervention, we aren't the pros here. So we really encourage you to take a course that is linked below. I think it will be placed in the chat. But this is Badass Bystander Moves, which is the 5 Ds. So they'll go over direct, distract, delegate, document, and delay. So it's a really cool event. So you should definitely register for the training. And then I can pass it over.
I think this leads us to our next section where we will be engaging in a small group discussion for a few minutes just to reflect further on what you learned and perhaps discuss what you'd like to learn. We're going to break out into groups of 5 for about 10 minutes or so. Max is going to prepare that for us. And what we'd like to do is come back in about 5 minutes, or excuse me, come back and discuss for 5 minutes any thoughts, and each group should also choose a facilitator. So without further ado, Max, are you
Yep,
able to?
I'm going to set this up right now.